Welcome, everyone. Today, we are going to step back in time and we're going to talk a little bit about my childhood and what it was like growing up in the 60s and 70s in the Kansas prairie farmland. A lot of us today can't even picture what that would have been like because things have become so advanced, so full of technology that to step back in time, sometimes it seems like it's romanticized, and sometimes it seems like it would be the perfect way to live. But to people nowadays, I think it would be a hard step back into time to go from everything we have now to what we had then. Let's talk about it today. I grew up very old fashioned and more old fashioned than even some of my friends. My parents were older. They were born in 1929 and 1931. A lot of my friends' parents were born like in the 40s. So I had older parents and they raised me very, very frugally, very old fashioned, but I had a wonderful childhood. I look back on it now with all of the things that I learned from them and all of the knowledge that I gained from them growing up during the Great Depression. And I'm so thankful for that with all of the inflation and the cost of living crisis that's going on today. It really has helped me retire early and be able to live frugally and not lay awake at night and worry about how I'm going to make ends meet. I'm confident I can make ends meet. And that is wholly based on how I was raised and what I learned from them. Growing up back then, we used our imagination so much. And I think some of that is lost today. And as we grow up, we lose some of that imagination and some of that creativity. And I have really tried to tap into that into retirement because I feel like imagination and creativity save us money and they are important skills. And when I grew up, I would pretend that I had like a fort and I would even take roll call. My nephew was 5 years younger. He would come over. My niece was like 7 years younger, and we would play together. They were actually closer in age to me than my own siblings. And we would have the cats be members of our little fort. I mean, we just had a great time playing in the trees and pretending. And I think a lot of that has disappeared nowadays. I shared the other day how I did tent forts with my grandchildren and how much they loved them. So often they are presented with toys or with television programs, and that pretending goes by the wayside. But that imagination is something we can really tap into as adults to help us use up things that we have in the house, figure out how to repurpose things so that we don't have to buy something else. They're great, important skills. We also had simple things like coloring, and coloring is even good for adults. My brother in the nursing home is really enjoying some adult coloring books with markers. He loves that. And a lot of people have thought, oh, coloring is for kids or maybe for someone with dementia. No, coloring is relaxing, it is freeing, and it can really release anxiety and stress. Sometimes just getting that crayon and just filling in a big open space can really release that stress. I shared with you here in one of my past videos that I had about a week that I was kind of feeling bored and a little overwhelmed because I had a lot of appointments. We have a family member that's really ill right now, and some of those things were starting to weigh heavily on me. I pulled out some color books from when I was decluttering, and they still had some open pages in them. And I pulled out the crayons and I just colored for about 30 to 45 minutes. And that made me feel so much better. Coloring can actually be its own form of therapy. Many of you probably don't know, but I actually grew up in a building that was part of a schoolhouse. It was built in addition to the schoolhouse, it was the science building. And we moved there when I was 5 because the farm had nitrate water. And living in this schoolhouse, my dad remade the inside of it. He built bedrooms. He made it into a home. You would have never known that it used to be part of a school when he got done with it. I watched him create this masterpiece out of this stone building, and I grew up there knowing that anything was possible. It seemed like my dad could do anything that he wanted to do. And he dropped out of school his 10th grade year, but he was so smart and so skilled with his hands. We rarely needed anybody else to help us with anything because dad could always do it. I grew up playing school in the furnace room of this old schoolhouse. It was a decent sized room, and I had books that my teachers no longer needed that were like school teacher editions that had all the answers in them. And they would let us just take them home when they got new books. And I had a bunch of these with the red answers in them, like I was a teacher. And I would pretend and play school. I would play school with my stuffed animals and my dolls. I would make worksheets. I would complete them. I would grade them with red crayon. And for many years, I thought I would be a school teacher when I grew up. I think I got my first bicycle when I was somewhere around 6th grade. And I remember my dad taking it for a trial run in the front yard. And I thought that was the most fun thing I had ever seen in my life. My dad actually riding my small bicycle and showing me how to ride a bicycle. He rarely had time to play with us, he was always working. And I was only allowed to ride it on the 1 acre that we owned. And we had a really big front yard, and I would ride it in circles. I wasn't allowed to ride it on the street or on the highway because my mom was worried that we would get hit by a vehicle. So I had to ride it on the land that we owned. But it was okay because I had plenty of room to ride it and make circles and do that loop again. So my closest sibling in age was almost 9 years older than me. And one of our favorite things in the summer is we would get a mail order catalog in the mail from a library that was about an hour or more away. And they would have books in there that you were allowed to check out. They would mail them to you with a postage to mail them back, and with a little postcard where you could choose 4 more books. The days that we got that catalog in the mail and got to go through and mark it of all the ones that we wanted to read that summer, those were the best days of summer. And then sending that card in and waiting every day in the mail for those books to come back, and then getting our books and being able to read those and then being able to choose the next 4. It made our summer so wonderful because we didn't go to the pool. We didn't go to the library. We didn't have any entertainment other than what was at our home. We spent a lot of time in the fields in the summer, and that gave us time to sit in the vehicle and read our books. And so that's what I did a lot of the time in the summer. I sat in a wheat field in the front of the cab, reading my library books, coloring, and using my imagination until it was time for us to either eat a meal or go home for the day. So I don't want it to sound like my brother was in the vehicle with me at the wheat field. He was running equipment. The boys were taught to run equipment from a very young age. We had tractors and combines that had no cab, no air conditioning, and they were taught from a young age to stay in the tracks and either disc or plow or cut wheat or load bales. And I spent most of my time in the cab of the truck by myself. But it was okay because I didn't know any different. This was my life. This was my summer. And this was something that I did all the time. And I didn't have anybody else's life to compare it to. There wasn't social media for me to look at and say, well, my friends are getting to do this. If you heard from your friend that summer, it would be because you maybe wrote them a letter and they wrote you a letter back. We didn't get a phone until I was in junior high. That's also when we got our first microwave. Things were very, very primitive in the way that I grew up. I used a CB radio at school if I got sick to call to have someone come get me. We didn't have a phone. So things were way different back then, but we made them work. When I was in junior high, my mom also got her first job outside of the home and she worked nights. But we always had a hot breakfast before school, and cartoons were on Saturday mornings only. And that was the only time we were allowed to have cold cereal. And cold cereal was either like shredded wheat in the big biscuits or Cheerios or grape nuts. It was any of those old fashioned cereals that didn't have all the sugar. That was the choices that we had growing up on Saturday morning. But Saturday morning was special because it was cartoons and it was cold cereal. I got my first stereo when I was a freshman in high school. Up until that time, my brothers had like transistor radios with the battery and the little antenna, or they had radios like clock radios that would plug into the wall and you listened to a radio station if you could get a good signal. Music was either a large album that you could put on dad's old record player. It was more like a phonograph, just one of those old fashioned boxes that opened up and it plugged in and you could play a record. And we had a lot of his old records there that we could choose from, and we had to be super careful. But they were all the old country hits of his era. So unless you could get a good station, you weren't listening to anything current. But these are some of the best memories of my life, are sitting around and listening to my dad play the guitar and sing. And he learned to play the guitar by ear, and he would play things and sing for us in the evenings. My uncle handmade baby beds for each of his nieces, and this is the one that I received when I was born. I used it for all of my six children for the first 6 weeks after they came home from the hospital. And now one of my daughters is using it for her babies. And then it will be passed on to my granddaughter. And of course, in between me getting it when I was born and then me getting old enough to have children, all of my dolls got to use that baby bed. And same with my daughters. Their dolls got to use it until they were old enough to put an actual baby in it. Since I became an aunt at 5 years old, I also gained my first sister. I had a sister in law that was very crafty, and she would make things for me because they didn't have much money. And I received things made out of cigar boxes. And here is the dollhouse that she made me out of an old wooden milk crate. She put in carpet, she put in little shiny reflectors like off of your compact case as mirrors, and she decorated it beautifully. And I still have this today. She also spent the time to teach me how to embroidery at 5 years old. And I still do that today. Many of you have seen the creations that I make. And that is something that she gave me that was invaluable. Her time spent teaching a 5 year old and helping me get my knots out whenever I would mess something up. My dad and my grandpa always had huge gardens. And because they were my role models, I also was allowed to have a garden of my own. And I grew things like radishes and carrots and green beans. And I learned from a young age how satisfying doing something like that for yourself could be, and how fun it was to go out and pick fresh produce. So I feel like so many of these skills that I learned growing up have carried with me into adulthood, and they have made such a difference in my retirement. And I share these things with you on this channel because I hope to spread this information to other people and maybe inspire them to try a few of these things while the cost of living is so high, because these things can actually save you money, even though they sound like such simple concepts. If you made it this far into the video, I appreciate you listening to how I was raised. I enjoyed doing this video for you. I hope you enjoyed it as well. And maybe it gave you a little bit of frugal inspiration, either for your day to day life or maybe for your grandchildren. Thanks for listening today, and I hope to see you in the next video.